waste sites. And in the Senate, meanwhile, the unemployment insurance bill has moved forward. Debate, 30 hours of debate is underway, and you can follow that over on our companion network, C-SPAN 2.
The gentleman from Florida could hold it down for a moment. The gentleman from Florida. Yes, you, the gentleman from Florida. A call of the House is ordered to ascertain the presence of a quorum. Members will record their presence by electronic device.
The U.S. House gaveling in, as you heard from the Speaker. This is a call to the floor, a quorum call, bringing members to the floor, establishing that quorum for the second session of the 113th Congress. This is live coverage here on C-SPAN. No legislative work this evening in the House. They'll get to work tomorrow. And for a look at what's ahead this week and in the coming weeks, we spoke to a Capitol Hill reporter. As the House gavels in for the second session of the 113th Congress, House Republican leaders plan to take up another bill later this week dealing with the health care law. Emma Dumaine, who covers Congress for CQ Roll Call, joins us. What do House leaders have planned later this week?
House leaders are putting 2 votes on the floor related to the 2010 health law. One of these bills would require the Department of Health and Human Services to notify individuals within 2 days if they have been subject to a security breach, if their information has somehow been tapped into or stolen or unlawfully accessed through the exchanges online through healthcare.gov. Another legislation to be voted on at the end of this week would require the administration to submit very detailed weekly reports with the breakdown state by state of enrollment in the exchanges on healthcare.gov and all consumer interactions with the website. Basically, there are 2 bills targeting the law, targeting the website, meant to shed light on the areas of the rollout of the Affordable Care Act that aren't working as well as the administration might have planned.
Well, in terms of their strategy on the ACA, how does it differ from their efforts, 40 or more efforts during the first session of the 113th and the latter parts of the 112th? What's different about it in 2014 for House Republican leaders?
Well, I think that, you know, even though their ultimate desire is to fully defund and dismantle the Affordable Care Act, their new strategy appears to be chipping away at many of its components, and when they can't chip away, they undermine its credibility. These are absolutely bills to undermine their credibility. They are convinced, Republicans are convinced that there are security issues, that there are vulnerabilities in the infrastructure of the website, that the website is so flawed that individuals can't sign up for the health care that they're entitled to, the new insurance plans under this law. If they can pass bills that would require individuals being notified of security breaches, if they can get the government every week to show just how many people are enrolling, the expectation, the hope for Republicans is that numbers will come out of those reports that would be less than favorable for Democrats and for the White House. That's the hope.
On another issue off the floor, where do things stand on negotiations over spending? The House and Senate face that January 15th deadline, so when are they going to get done with this omnibus spending bill?
The expectation is that they'll be able to finish it by January 15th when current fiscal 2014 funding is set to expire. We passed a short-term continuing resolution, as you know, before we left for the holiday break. The Senate is quickly moving through all of its portions of what they expect to be an omnibus, a sort of a package of all of the 12 appropriations bills. Some of the more contentious bills, such as the one to fund the Departments of Labor and Health and Human Services. There's still outstanding issues there, but the Senate is hoping to have something by the end of this week. In the House, we have less of a sense right now of where progress is, but appropriators are continuing to meet. They met virtually or in person throughout the holiday break. Have been speaking regularly, their staff and the members of the committee leadership, and they seem optimistic that they can get this done, even though we know very little so far about what the outstanding issues are and where the points of contention might still rest.
You tweeted yesterday about unemployment insurance.
Mm-hmm.
The tweet was, "Jobless benefits may stay on Congress's cutting room floor." The Senate moves forward with the unemployment insurance bill. If it passes the Senate later this week, early next week, is the House expected to take up that issue? And what else might we see on the House agenda in just the early couple of weeks coming up?
Unemployment insurance is still an unknown in the House. House Republicans insist that they're not going to take it up unless there's an offset. Democrats say that it shouldn't be paid for. It doesn't need to be paid for. They don't have a plan right now. They don't have a proposal for how to pay for it. And seem disinclined to accept anything Republicans might suggest to sort of sweeten the deal, to make it more palatable to their members to bring it to the floor. Democrats hope that Republicans could be shamed into bringing it to the floor, similarly to how they were quote-unquote shamed to bring up the Violence Against Women Act and the bill to provide relief for Superstorm Sandy, but it remains to be seen whether that so-called shaming effort will even be at all successful in the House. Other things we expect to see, again, the omnibus. The clock is ticking on that one. We have to pass a 5-year farm bill. The conferees in the House and Senate are expected to meet on Thursday, having one of their only public meetings as a conference committee to vote on some of the outstanding issues there in preparation to reveal a formal finished farm bill by, they hope by the long weekend surrounding Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday later this month. And that's just some of what we're going to see, and some of the issues we're going to see fiercely debated on the floor in the weeks ahead.
Emma Domain, she's with CQ Roll Call. You can follow some of her reporting on Twitter as well at Emma_Domain. Thanks for that update.
Thank you.
The House has gavelled in to establish a quorum and open the second session of the 113th Congress, and this will be the only action this evening. Legislative work getting underway tomorrow. Meanwhile, in the Senate, earlier today, they voted 60-37 to advance that 3-month unemployment insurance benefits bill. Those benefits expiring at the end of December 2013. These would extend them through March. The Senate in 30 hours of debate, and that's underway, and you can follow that on C-SPAN 2. Today, during the party lunches, Democratic leaders talked about the vote and the debate ahead on unemployment. We'll show you as much of that as this call of the House continues on the floor.
Excuse me.
I think most everyone knows that in America today, the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, and the middle class is being squeezed. I don't begrudge rich Americans the success they've had. That's part of our system, and I think that's good. But we have to make sure that we don't try to grow our economy from the top down. We need to build from the middle out. We haven't been doing that. That's why I'm pleased that 6 of my Republican colleagues joined in moving forward. I have said, I certainly congratulate Senator Heller in bringing 5 people with him. That's important for America. Even as our economy continues to show signs of improvement, there's still only 1 job opening for every 3 people out of work. In Nevada, not extending unemployment benefits cut almost 20,000 people from the rolls. these Nevadans and the more than 1 million Americans who've lost way to survive is extremely difficult. This insurance is a lifeline for them. I don't think anyone would consider about $300 a week much of a lifeline, but that's the average. But it certainly is $300 a week better than nothing. These are long-term unemployed. My colleagues say they want to pay for this bill. This is new religion for them because all 5 times that President Bush signed extended unemployment benefits wasn't paid for. So I say to my Republican colleagues, this is a 3-month extension. Let's pass this bill so that our fellow Americans, more than 1 million of them, don't have to suffer and can keep, and we can then talk about the long-term plan. It's the right thing to do. People across the country are watching us because the vast majority of Americans support extending these unemployment benefits.
Senator Reid, are you open to allowing amendments on this?
The question is, am I open to allowing amendments on this? Well, here's where we start. Senator McConnell says that he wants to pay for these extended benefits. Remember, never done with President Bush. He wants to pay for them by whacking Obamacare. That's a non-starter. So if they come with something that's serious, I'll talk to them. But right now, everyone should understand the low-hanging fruit is gone. We've scavenged every place we could go. I talked to the White House an hour or so ago. Talked to Jack Reed. We know how desperate these 1.2 million Americans are. But we have to be realistic too. We know the Republicans are not going to allow us to close these long overdue tax loopholes. So they come up with all this chicanery like whacking Obamacare more.
Senator Reid, so the answer is no?
The answer is we'll take a look if they have something that's serious.
Senator Reid, what about the vote on the possibility of an unemployment extension offset as well as the agreement itself? The Farm Bill. How's the conference going and could that money be used for unemployment?
The Farm Bill is less than $20 billion. I understand that they've cut some of the savings we had before. Senator Stabenow thinks that sometime this week the conference could be completed. I hope that's the case, and certainly that's a place we could look for some money.
Senator Reid, do you plan to bring Iran sanctions legislation from your colleagues to the floor?
We have a bipartisan bill that's been filed. We have, they're gathering co-sponsors at this time. I haven't talked to Secretary Kerry for some time. I haven't talked in any detail to Senator Menendez for a week or so. So we'll wait and see what develops. As you know, it's an issue that is important, and the Iranians have to understand that we're not going to let them have a nuclear weapon.
Senator Reid, Senator Kirk, who occasionally votes with you guys, said that you're not really being very serious with the pay fors and that you're making Republicans take painful votes to score political points. Would you
On what?
On unemployment insurance.
Votes, plural? We've only had one vote.
So far, yes.
Well, you have to talk to Senator Kirk. I don't know what he's talking about. And anyway, that's enough.
Senator Reid?
Yes.
Did you get an update on the omnibus we're sending in the
Yes, I sure did.
What did she tell you?
She is cautiously optimistic. She believes we should be able to get this done. She reported to the caucus today. You could talk to her in more detail. But she said they've made a lot of progress. There's been, I don't know how many of the subcommittees, but I think 7 or 8 of them have been closed out. So we're waiting to see.
Will some of these bills go by CR in a package?
She does not want anything to go by CR. And I don't either.
theory, are you open to a paid-for unemployment extension? I know it's never been done, but would you accept one if you had to pay for that are more acceptable?
I personally am not in favor of a paid-for unemployment insurance. It's an emergency, and I'm not in favor of it. But if they have something, I'll bring it to my caucus, and we'll take a look at it.
Has the White House indicated their position on a paid-for?
I talked to Dennis McDonough today before I came to my caucus, the President's Chief of Staff, and he said they'll run the traps on this. You know, it's really hard to find anything, and it's, as one of my senators mentioned at the caucus, it's really doesn't make a lot of sense to take something out of the economy that's creating jobs to pay for unemployment compensation. Everyone knows that for every dollar we put into unemployment compensation, we get $1.50 back. Yes?
He said he's going to run the traps, though, to see if it works.
He's kind of saying, like I'm saying, certainly for this 3 months, this definitely should not be paid for. If they can come up with some, they meaning the Republicans, something that's reasonable for a year-long extension, we'll take a look at it.
The Republicans come up with an extension. The Speaker Boehner said he's willing to listen to Democrats. I guess that means nothing.
I'm sorry, he said what?
Speaker Boehner said he's willing to listen to Democrats on an offset. So should the onus be on them or here in the Senate?
Well, they're the one that want it paid for. Why should we be looking? We don't think it should be paid for. Why should the onus be on us?
They don't want to do it, though, at all.
Who's they?
The House Republicans.
Well, if they want unemployment compensation to pass, they have a funny way of showing it.
Senator, is it your belief that even if you don't allow offsets, that the pressure on these 6 Republicans who voted today will be so great that they will have to vote to end debate on the bill?
You know, this is not a question of putting pressure on people. It's a question of taking care of people who are seriously in trouble. This is not a handful of people around the country that have few problems. Tens of thousands of veterans unemployed, long-term unemployed. So this is just basic fairness. Basic fairness. How can you in good conscience say we want this paid for when, talk about John McCain's chief economic advisor, Mark Zandi, is one of the economists, and there's scores of them, that said for every dollar put into unemployment compensation, you get $1.50 back. What are they talking about, paying for this? Thanks, everyone.
The Senate Majority Leader earlier this afternoon, after the Senate voted 60 to 37 to move forward with legislation that would extend unemployment benefits for another 3 months, they ran out at the end of 2013, December 28th to be exact. On the House floor, this is a call of the House, calling members to the House floor to establish a quorum for the second session of the 113th Congress. So far, you can see on your screen some 280 plus members voting their presence on the floor. Well, Republican senators also commented on that vote. That 60 to 37 vote. 6 Republicans voted along with all Democrats in moving the bill forward. Here's what Senator Mitch McConnell and other Republican leaders had to say.
Just crossing to the other side.
Well, Happy New Year, everyone. As you know, we're in the post-cloture period on the unemployment insurance bill the majority leaders brought up, and it raises the question that is all too often raised around here these days: are we going to have amendments or not? I'm not going to make this into a quiz because I don't think any of you would get the answer right, but you'd be interested to know that there have been four roll call votes on Republican amendments since July. 4. This is the Senate under the current Majority Leader. I expect he said to you he would decide whether we would have any amendments. He would decide whether they were reasonable. The Senate hadn't been run this way in its history. It's been open for amendments and discussions. A number of my members have amendments that they would like to offer related to jobs and employment. Senator Ayotte, Senator Paul, Senator Hatch and I have a proposal. It's really not the responsibility of the Majority Leader to tell the minority whether they can have votes. That's not his job, to dictate to us whether we can have votes or to decide for himself whether our amendments are appropriate to be considered. So we begin the Senate new year the way we ended the Senate last year, with a dysfunctional Senate, almost entirely the responsibility of the Majority Leader. This really needs to change. The American people sent all of us here, expected us to have an opportunity, to have an input.
The Chair has examined the journal of the proceedings of January 3rd, 2014, and announces to the House his approval thereof. Pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1, the journal stands approved. Pledge of allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe. The House will be in order. The gentleman from Texas may proceed.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Now, order for Mr.
The Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable, the Speaker, House of Representatives. Sir, this is to formally notify you of my intent to resign as Chief Administrative Officer, CAO, effective at the close of business on January 6, 2014. Thank you for the opportunity to serve you and the U.S. House of Representatives. Over the course of my 28 years as a staff member, I have developed a deep respect and reverence for the institution, and in particular, the members and staff whose dedication and commitment to service make it an exciting, vibrant, and interactive community. Additionally, I want to thank Ed Cassidy of your staff for his leadership, direction, and support as Director of House Operations. He has done a tremendous job instilling and fostering a culture of collaboration and coordination within and among the institutional entities that support the House. Finally, I want to thank my colleagues in the Office of the CAO and all the other institutional offices whose nonpartisan professionalism serve as a model of excellence for other legislative bodies. I will work with my successor as needed to ensure a smooth transition. Signed sincerely, Daniel J. Strodel.
Without objection, the resignation is accepted. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I offer a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 449, resolution. Resolved that Ed Cassidy of the State of Connecticut be and is hereby chosen Chief Administrative Officer of the House of Representatives.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Will Mr. Cassidy please take the well of the House? First, please rise. And will the House be in order? The Chair will now administer the oath of office to the Chief Administrative Officer. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that you will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that you will take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that you will well and faithfully discharge the duties on which you're about to enter, so help you God. Congratulations, Mr. Gaffney. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 450, resolution resolved that a committee of 2 members be appointed by the Speaker on the part of the House of Representatives to notify the President of the United States that a quorum of the House has assembled and that the House is ready to receive any communication that he may be pleased to make.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to House Resolution 450, the Chair appoints the following members to the committee to notify the President of the United States that a quorum of the House has assembled and that the House is ready to receive any communication that he may be pleased to make.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Cantor, and the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Pelosi.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 451, resolution resolved that the Clerk of the House inform the Senate that a quorum of the House is present and that the House is ready to proceed with business.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I send to the desk a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
Clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 452, resolution resolved that unless otherwise ordered, the hour of daily meeting of the House shall be 2 p.m. on Mondays, noon on Tuesdays, or 2 p.m. if no legislative business was conducted on the preceding Monday, noon on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and 9 a.m. on all other days of the week.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the order of the House of January 3, 2013, providing for morning hour debate, be extended for the remainder of the 113th Congress, except that House Resolution 452 shall supplant House Resolution 9, and the Speaker may dispense with morning hour debate upon receipt of a notification described in Clause 12C of Rule 1 and notify members accordingly.
Without objection, the motion is agreed to.
Okay, that seems to be it. Awesome. So what happened is...
So you don't have to go tell the President we're in.
Let's just put on who's going to figure.
The Chair lays before the House the following enrolled bill.
Senate 1614, an act to require certificates of citizenship and other federal documents to reflect name and date of birth determinations made by a state court and for other purposes.
The Chair will entertain requests for 1-minute speeches. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, the House is not in order.
Will be in order. The gentleman deserves to be heard. Please take your conversations off the floor. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Madam Speaker, she was a little bitty tiny thing, weighing barely over 5 pounds. 4 days after Christmas, she was born at 4:25 a.m. Sunday morning, December 29th, 2013 in Dallas, Texas. 2 days later, on New Year's Eve, Rosalind Marie Shoemaker came home with her adoptive parents, Kelly and Anthony, and 3-year-old sister, Olivia. Roz, as she is already nicknamed, is a good sleeper, healthy eater, and a cuddler. Kelly, my daughter, and Anthony, her husband, are model, God-fearing parents of strong character and have a compassion for children. Being parents is the hardest and most important role and job. Roz could have none better. During Christmas, Christians honor the most important child ever born. But in our family, this past Christmas season, we know that unto us a special child was also born. Her name is Roz. My hope and prayer for Roz is that she grows up in wisdom and stature and favor with the good Lord. Roz is our 11th grandchild. Like her 10 cousins, she too was born in Texas. Of course she was born in Texas, because that's the rule. And that's just the way it is. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman recognized for 1 minute.
Honored today to recognize legendary Livermore High School scorekeeper Pete Anderson, who sadly passed away on Sunday, December 29th. He was 91. After emigrating from Denmark to the United States in 1922, Pete went to high school in Pleasanton and served in the U.S. Army during World War II. Upon returning home from the war, Pete began keeping score at Livermore High School sporting events. Pete had an impressive 60-year, 3,513-game tenure and built a reputation for dedication, knowledge, and a passion for sports. It's because of his dedication to our community that Pete was inducted into the first class of the Livermore High School Sports Hall of Fame in 2009. I would like to express my deepest condolences to Pete's wife, Margaret, his family, and friends. And talking about his sacrifice for 60 years to keep score for young athletes, he said, "It was a nice place to go on a Friday night." Well, Friday nights in Livermore won't be the same without Pete. Pete will be missed dearly. His life is truly an inspiration to athletes, coaches, students, and the East Bay sporting community. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition? Gentlewoman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today, the President called on Congress to take action to help put Americans back to work. Almost 9 months ago, the House passed H.R. 803, the Skills Act, with bipartisan support. The Skills Act, which I authored, would modernize the vast labyrinth of federal workforce development programs, increasing access, eliminating waste, and promoting accountability. This bill is languishing in the Senate. As we gavel in the second session of the 113th Congress, this House will maintain its focus on jobs. Our top priority is creating an environment conducive to economic growth and job creation. In last year's session, the House passed more than 30 pieces of legislation designed to decrease bureaucracy, increase opportunity, and restore vitality to our economy. Unfortunately, the majority of this legislation is being held up in the Senate. I join the President in calling for action on jobs, starting with Senate consideration of the Skills Act. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, as we begin the second session of the 113th Congress, Americans all over this country are coming up with their New Year's resolutions for 2014. In Congress, I propose we make this the year we stop ignoring climate change. Last year, CO2 concentrations reached dangerous new heights in our atmosphere. We suffered through and paid for record-breaking extreme weather events, and we received dire new projections from international scientific organizations on the threat posed by climate change. And what did the Republican-led House do? It continued its anti-environment voting record, voting 109 times in 2013 to weaken environmental protections. This behavior is reckless and irresponsible. Despite the gridlock in Congress, the Obama administration has been making progress. Under the President's leadership, the nation has doubled the production of renewable energy like wind and solar. Vehicles are more fuel efficient, and toxic air pollution for power plants has been cut dramatically. Let's work with the President this year to build off these successes so that December 31 we can look with pride that we finally took action on climate change.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the White House claimed Obamacare is partially responsible for helping to slow the growth rate in health care spending. Health care spending did grow at a record slow pace in 2012. Unfortunately, according to NPR, and I quote, "The federal officials who compiled the report disagree with the Obama administration about why," end of quote. That's right. The annual report from the actuaries at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services disagree with the White House. NPR disagrees as well. I quote, "One thing that did not lead to slower growth, according to the report's authors, was the Affordable Care Act," end of quote. It's the recession, not Obamacare, that is slowing health spending, writes the National Journal. Mr. Speaker, hospital costs are increasing. Out-of-pocket costs continue to increase, and any reduction in the rate of growth isn't due to the Affordable Care Act. A closer look at the numbers shows us that this law has made matters worse. A closer look at the numbers tells us more about what the White House would rather not discuss. A closer look tells us that the American people deserve better. And I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the Speaker. Speaker, right now, 1.3 million Americans are asking the question why. Why is there a debate about my ability to pay for rent, or mortgage, or food, or the necessities of taking care of my family? Why, having worked for many, many years, am I now being denied an unemployment insurance benefit that was utilized for the last 5 years and first voted on and brought forward by the Congress that supported President Bush in extending unemployment benefits? Why is there not an understanding what it's like to receive a letter in the mail to indicate that you will get no more benefits, even though you're actively looking for work and even though there are 3 people looking for every job? And why does this House of Representatives not understand that we can pass a 3-month emergency relief for these individuals and debate for the rest of the year how do we get a payoff or an offset for funding it after 3 months? Mr. Speaker, this is an emergency and people are on a lifeline and we are killing it. It is time to pass unemployment insurance benefits now for the American people. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Consent to address the House 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, this weekend the Armed Forces community lost a great friend and ally. Retired Army Lieutenant Colonel John Chaplow was truly a Virginia gentleman of the Virginia Military Institute tradition. After serving our nation in uniform for over 25 years, John continued his passion for public service as a professional staff member of the House Armed Services Committee, eventually becoming the lead staff member for the Subcommittee on Military Personnel. John possessed vast and remarkable wisdom of the military. He always sought to advocate for our brave men and women, their families, and our veterans. I had the privilege of working alongside him for 4 years as he coordinated the annual National Defense Authorization Act. Because of John's efforts, our wounded warriors, military families, and victims of sexual assault have substantial protections. There is no doubt that our country is a much safer place because of John Chaplow's hard work and dedication. My thoughts and prayers are with John's wife, Lee, his 2 daughters, and 3 granddaughters during this difficult time. He will be forever appreciated. In conclusion, God bless our troops, and we'll never forget September 11th and the global war on terrorism.
For what purpose does the gentleman from from Connecticut seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 10 days ago, 1.3 million Americans lost their emergency extension of unemployment benefits. Today, this afternoon at the White House, one of those individuals, Ms. Catherine Hackett from Moosip, Connecticut, shared her story with our country. She has 2 sons serving in the military. She was laid off through no fault of her own. She's been actively seeking employment, and yet she still needs help. And yet this House left before Christmas without taking up an unemployment extension, which in every past recession, any unemployment rate above 5% required and resulted in automatic extensions, yet this House went home. Kurt Edwards from Norwich, Connecticut, I spoke to yesterday, 20 years in the U.S. Army, Army Ranger, was laid off last April, looking for work. His unemployment was cut off on December 28th. The majority leader issued his agenda for the month of January. Not a word in that agenda about extending unemployment for 1.3 million Americans. Every economist tells us that's a mistake. These individuals need help. It is time for this House to focus on the immediate needs of the American people and extend unemployment insurance for 1.3 million Americans. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, January is National Slavery and Human Trafficking Prevention Month, and it is a perfect time to highlight the terrible reality of sex trafficking that is happening in our communities. It's also an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, an opportunity to take steps to combat this growing problem that now puts 300,000 children at risk in the United States, many of whom are 12 to 14-year-old girls. I'm authoring several bipartisan bills to address sex trafficking. One gives law enforcement additional tools to turn the tide against sex trafficking and help the victims of these horrific crimes receive the support they need and deserve. And that's what these young girls are. Victims. The second bill improves data systems that track missing children because better information will help us find better solutions. Mr. Speaker, it's time to end sex trafficking, and there's bipartisan support for action. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on this first day of our 2014 session to pay tribute to a husband, a father, a son, and a San Antonian. Bobby Deckard was a San Antonio police officer who died on Friday, December the 20th. He had come in on his day off to substitute for a colleague when he was shot in the line of duty. He was only 31 years of age. This past Saturday, San Antonio and its citizens came together to honor Bobby's life, to bid him a final farewell. Thousands of people lined the streets, and thousands of police officers from throughout the country were present as police helicopters flew in formation above the burial service in remembrance of someone who spent 7 years of his life helping the citizens of San Antonio. During the ceremony, the San Antonio Police Chief, William McManus, instructed the police dispatchers to retire his badge number, 0582, and every officer throughout the city heard the retirement of that badge number. In a November email, ironically, Bobby Deckard had aspired to join the Honor Guard that, in fact, escorted his flag-draped coffin. In an email to his supervisor, he wrote that was the highest position of honor inside the department. That tells us so much about him even as we mourn his loss. One with a positive outlook, a great personality, his humor could win anybody over. Mr. Speaker and members, I ask that we all take a moment to remember Bobby Deckard, police officer, San Antonio, Texas, whose name will now be added to the National Law Enforcement Memorial, the only memorial in Washington that has never been completed. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I introduced H.R. 2906, the Fairness to Veterans Act, because I believe that if anyone deserves a leg up in America, it's those who've served on our behalf. The Fairness to Veterans Act is straightforward. It says that if any business receives a contracting preference, then a veteran-owned small business should receive that very same preference. I call this bill Fairness to Veterans because I believe it is only fair that if we're going to be singling out certain businesses to receive special consideration for government contracts, then that same benefit should be extended to veteran-owned small businesses. More than 250,000 service members are transitioning each year from military to civilian life. 2.4 million veterans own a small business of their own, and overall, 1 in 4 veterans say that they want to start a business. This bipartisan bill makes sure that we're tapping into the most highly skilled workforce in history and utilizing their unique skills to get our economy moving again. Mr. Speaker, whether my colleagues believe there should be contracting preferences or not is not at the heart of this legislation. The question here is, do members believe that veterans deserve to be on a level playing field with anyone when bidding for government contracts? And I believe the answer to that question is a resounding yes, and I urge my colleagues to co-sponsor H.R. 2906. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's cold outside. And for too many Americans who have been unemployed for too long, because this Congress has failed to act, it is now a little bit harder for those Americans who are actively seeking work to get the emergency unemployment benefits that they need so that they can keep their homes warm for them and their families as they continue to seek employment. For the 1.3 million Americans that we left behind by failing to extend emergency unemployment benefits before we left, this is the week when the checks stop. This is the week when it becomes more difficult for them to keep a roof over their heads, to keep a warm environment for their families as they continue to seek employment. Mr. Speaker, we have an obligation to move forward to make sure that those benefits are continued. It's the right thing to do. It's time for this Congress to act. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Speaker, I rise to ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 moment.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to congratulate this year's BCS national champions, Florida State Seminoles. In one of the greatest championship games of the BCS era, head coach Jimbo Fisher and Heisman Trophy winner Jameis Winston led the Seminoles to a thrilling come-from-behind victory last night over the Auburn Tigers, to a 34-31 victory. With 1 minute and 11 seconds left, the Seminoles drove 80 yards to score the game-winning touchdown, thereby capping an undefeated season. As the representative of Florida's 2nd Congressional District, I could not be more proud. As the Bowl Championship Series comes to a close, the Florida State faithful can forever take pride in knowing that the last BCS title will forever reside in Tallahassee, Florida. And on behalf of the people of North and Northwest Florida and Florida's 2nd Congressional District, I extend my congratulations to the coaches and players who helped us provide a wonderful year for the fans in such an exciting season. I yield back the balance of my time with 2 simple words. I will yield.
Ask unanimous consent that the gentleman have an additional 2 minutes. Without objection.
Entertain that request.
Cannot entertain. How much? Well, in the gentleman's remaining time, I would just ask the gentleman, congratulations to Florida State. Us from Michigan would love to see a unanimous consent that perhaps the Seminoles could play the Spartans for a national championship and see that occur in the next couple of months. But congratulations to the gentleman.
I'd like to thank the gentleman,
it was a
both
great
gentlemen
game.
from Michigan.
Kept us up watching it.
Thank you very, very much for those sentiments and that offer. We'll contact the coach and see what we can do.
Be ready.
And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Without objection, does the gentleman... Yeah, for what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dennis Rodman of NBA fame has announced that he and 10 or so other basketball players are going to North Korea. He said to visit his friend, the notorious butcher and dictator Kim Jong-un of North Korea. Bringing American basketball to North Korea, a rogue state which has nuclear weapons, which starves its own people, imprisons them, throws them in jail. Bringing American basketball there and sitting down with a dictator like Mr. Kim would be the equivalent of taking Adolf Hitler to lunch. This is really a terrible thing a terrible idea, and it makes us gloss over the terrible suffering of the North Korean people and just ignore it and say, well, we're going to play basketball and we're going to make this guy look legitimate. And in a rambling discussion today on one of the networks, he said that he didn't even care that an American who was imprisoned, Mr. Kenneth Bae, in North Korea, and at the very least, we would hope that this American who was imprisoned for no reason by this brutal dictator would be released. We shouldn't be clicking glasses with him or playing basketball with this dictator. We should be demanding that an American citizen who committed no crime be released. I yield back.
For what purposes does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
1 minute revising extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to recognize a business in my district that celebrated its 60th anniversary this week. Riverside Pharmacy is an example of a small business that has survived the economic downturns, a changing healthcare landscape, and often unfair playing field to continue serving the people of Northeast Georgia. Local pharmacies such as Riverside play a vital role in America's neighborhoods. They provide unparalleled guidance, assistance, and resources for families, including my own. Joanne Adams and Charlie Johnson first opened Riverside on January 6, 1954. Now owned by Scotty Barton and Stephen G., Riverside Pharmacy has served generations of Georgians, helping to guide them through the often difficult health care decisions. Although the world we live in looks far removed from the 1950s, the focus of Riverside Pharmacy has remained on the patient, and I'm pleased to offer my heartfelt congratulations to Riverside on their 60th anniversary. We are so lucky to have them providing care to families in Northeast Georgia. The challenges facing independent community pharmacies are great, but the important role they play in our towns and states are even greater still. And with that, I yield back.
The chair lays before the House the following personal request.
Leave of absence requested for Mr. Heck of Nevada for today and the balance of the week. Mr. Jones of North Carolina for today through January 16th. Mr. Rupersberger of Maryland for today and the remainder of January. Mr. Van Hollen of Maryland for today.
Without objection, the requests are granted. The chair lays before the House a message.
To the Congress of the United States, I am pleased to transmit to the Congress, pursuant to Sections 123B and 123D of the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, as amended, the text of a proposed agreement for cooperation between the American Institute in Taiwan, AIT, and the Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative Office in the United States, TECRO, concerning peaceful uses of nuclear energy, the agreement. I am also pleased to transmit my written approval, authorization, and determination concerning the agreement and an unclassified nuclear proliferation assessment statement, NPAS, concerning the agreement. In accordance with Sections 123 of the Act, as amended by Title 12 of the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998, Public Law 105-277, a classified annex to the NPAS prepared by the Secretary of State in consultation with the Director of National Intelligence, summarizing relevant classified information, will be submitted to the Congress separately. The joint memorandum submitted to me by the Secretaries of State and Energy and a letter from the Chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, stating the views of the Commission are also enclosed. An addendum to the NPAS containing a comprehensive analysis of the export control system in Taiwan with respect to nuclear-related matters, including interactions with other countries of proliferation concern and the actual or suspected nuclear, dual-use, or missile-related transfers to such countries pursuant to Section 102A of the National Security Act of 1947, 50 U.S.C. 403-1 as amended, is being submitted separately by the Director of National Intelligence. The proposed agreement has been negotiated in accordance with the Act and other applicable law. In my judgment, it meets all applicable statutory requirements and will advance the nonproliferation and other foreign policy interests of the United States. The proposed agreement provides a comprehensive framework for peaceful nuclear cooperation with the authorities on Taiwan based on a mutual commitment to nuclear nonproliferation. The proposed agreement has an indefinite term from the date of its entry into force unless terminated by either party on 1 year's written notice. The proposed agreement permits the transfer of information, material, equipment, including reactors, and components for nuclear research and nuclear power production. The agreement also specifies cooperation shall be in accordance with the provisions of the agreement and applicable legal obligations, including, as appropriate, treaties, international agreements, domestic laws, regulations, and/or licensing requirements, such as those imposed by the NRC in accordance with 10 CFR 110 and the Department of Energy in accordance with 10 CFR 810. It does not permit transfers of restricted data, sensitive nuclear technology and facilities, or major critical components of such facilities. The proposed agreement also prohibits the possession of sensitive nuclear facilities and any engagement in activities involving sensitive nuclear technology in the territory of the authorities represented by TECRO. In the event of termination of the proposed agreement, key nonproliferation conditions and controls continue with respect to material, equipment, and components subject to the proposed agreement. Over the last 2 decades, authorities on Taiwan have established a reliable record on nonproliferation and on commitments to nonproliferation. While the political status of the authorities on Taiwan prevents them from formally extending to multilateral nonproliferation treaties or agreements, the authorities on Taiwan have voluntarily assumed commitments to adhere to the provisions of multilateral treaties and initiatives. The Republic of China ratified the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, in 1970 and ratified the Convention on the Prohibition of the Development, Production, and Stockpiling of Bacteriological, Biological, and Toxin Weapons, and on their destruction, the Biological Weapons Convention, or BWC, in 1972. The authorities on Taiwan have stated that they will continue to abide by the obligations of the NPT, i.e., those of non-nuclear weapon state, and the BWC, and the United States regards them as bound by both treaties. The authorities on Taiwan follow International Atomic Energy Agency standards and directives in their nuclear program, work closely with U.S. civilian nuclear authorities, and have established relationships with mainland Chinese civilian authorities with respect to nuclear safety. A more detailed discussion of the domestic civil nuclear activities and nuclear nonproliferation policies and practices of the authorities on Taiwan, including their nuclear export policies and practices, is provided in the MPAS and in a classified annex to the MPAS submitted separately. As noted above, the addendum to the MPAS containing a comprehensive analysis of the export control system of the authorities on Taiwan with respect to nuclear-related matters is being submitted to you separately by the Director of National Intelligence. I have enclosed the views and recommendations of the interested agencies in reviewing the proposed agreement and have determined that its performance will promote and will not constitute an unreasonable risk to the common defense and security. Accordingly, I have approved the agreement and authorized its execution and urge the Congress to give it favorable consideration. This transmission shall constitute a submittal for purposes of both Sections 123B and 123D of the Act. My administration is prepared to begin immediately the consultations with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee as provided in Section 123B. Upon completion of the 30 days of continuous session review provided for in Section 123B, the 60 days of continuous session review provided for in Section 123D shall commence. Signed, Barack Obama, the White House, January 7, 2014.
Referred to the Committee on Foreign Affairs and ordered printed. Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2014, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gohmert, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Majority Leader.
A great deal of news has come out. So many things have happened since we had recessed in December. Some things did not get the attention they should have. This is an article from the Daily Caller, December 18th, entitled Senate Democrats Block Amendment to Restore Veterans Benefits by Closing Illegal Immigrant Welfare Loophole. Now, Mr. Speaker, it would seem by anyone's standard of morality that when someone promises something in order to encourage or get someone else to expose themselves to death, to brutal treatment, and that person does so, they join the military, go through rigorous training, spend a career of 20 years or more defending the United States of America, following orders, that it would be morally reprehensible for anyone, or in this case any government, to pull back on the promises that were made to those who served, relying on those promises. In courts, that doctrine would be called promissory estoppel. Promises are made to induce someone else to act. The other does act in reliance on those promises to the actor's detriment. Then in a court system, a civilian would be required under the doctrine of promissory estoppel to provide what was promised. But the United States government is not subject to such claims in court, so it must rely upon Congress to have the moral compass and the conscience to keep our promises to those who have served enough years, long enough to retire. When I push for such benefits and the keeping of our word to our veterans, it's not something that inures to my benefit. I served in the Army, but only for 4 years. I did not reach the 20-year mark or more that would have entitled me to the promises that were made. But I know so many who had the chance to go back and make more money in the civilian sector and not give up their right of freedom of assembly, and had to assemble at 5 in the morning as we often did, or doing forced marches as we did, or doing so many things that were not fun or pleasant, but doing so because it was proper training to be in the United States military. We owe those who have served to keep our promises. When George Washington resigned as commander of the Revolutionary Military, it was an incredible act that constantly comes up both here and abroad when people both here and around the world look for an example of true selfless service to one's country. And how George Washington could serve as commander of the Revolutionary Military. The revolution is won, and he did what no one in the history of the world has ever done, won the revolution as commander of the military, and then resigned and in effect said, "I've done all you asked, now I'm going home." That was brought up to me in the Maldives Islands sometime back, that I was told we're a relatively new democracy, but we're always worried about a military coup because we never had the proper example like George Washington set. We never had a George Washington to set the proper example. And they've had a military coup since I was told that. But not only did George Washington resign, but at the end of his resignation, and this was something that was sent to all 13 governors, he had a prayer for the country. And part of that prayer was that we would never fail to remember, basically honoring those who have served in the field. And when, apparently on December 18th, the United States Senate voted against restoring the benefits that were taken away from veterans because they didn't want to close a loophole in the law that allows for people who come here illegally to get welfare. Because if that loophole had been closed, then people who come illegally would not be able to get welfare, and the money saved by closing that loophole would be enough to fund our promises that have been broken to our veterans under the brand new budget. I hope very soon that we'll have a chance to fix that in the House. It's the right thing to do. How else will we have the moral authority in Congress to do anything else if we can't keep our promises in answer to the prayer that George Washington had, that we would never forget those, that we would help those who have served in the field, our military. That is a travesty. On December 19th, the next day, there was an article in the Washington Times. Homeland Security helps smuggle illegal immigrant children into the United States. And it goes on to discuss a 10-page order by Judge Andrew S. Hainan. And Judge Hainan, it said the case was the fourth such case he's seen over the last month. And in each instance, Custom and Border Protection agents have helped to locate and deliver the children to their illegal immigrant parents. Now, Republicans believe in the sanctity of marriage and the sanctity and importance of families in America. When someone chooses to violate United States law and enter the United States illegally without proper documentation, no matter how noble the cause is believed to be to help family, obviously that's a noble cause. But if it's done illegally without documentation, it is an incredible disservice and affects so unfairly those who have stood in line, paid money after money, done everything the right way to gain entrance in the United States legally. There's one person to whom I spoke last Thursday that he was married to a woman that he tried for so long to get legally into the United States. Finally got her into the country legally. And it is so grossly unfair to the millions of people who have come into this country as immigrants legally. We are a nation of immigrants, as my friend Steve King says. There's really not a nation in the world, perhaps, that is not a nation of immigrants. But the United States certainly is. And the reason, one of the big reasons we've been able to become the most free, until Obamacare perhaps, but the most free nation in the world with the least government dictation and intervention in our private lives, and been the most blessed country, I believe even more so than Solomon's Israel, is because we were a nation of laws, as the founders described it, a nation where no one was perceived to be above the law. I even paid a parking ticket because people perceived that I had violated the law, and a national park policeman who did not know the law, was ignorant of the law, decided to give it. It was either easier to pay the $25 than it was to helped teach the National Park policemen the law on parking in Washington, D.C. Nobody's above the law. Nobody is supposed to be above the law. And there are verses throughout the Old Testament and New Testament. So many of the first 100 years of this nation's existence had scriptures quoted from the Old Testament and New Testament as a basis or reason that particular legislation should be passed. Well, one thing is clear in the Old Testament and New Testament, that showing partiality, showing favoritism to anyone, as Leviticus talks about it, whether it's to the very poor or the very wealthy, either way, it's not right, it's wrong. And if we're going to ever attain again moral authority as a Congress, we have to make sure the law is applied fairly across the board. When someone chooses to violate our laws by coming into the country, then we have a president who took an oath to see that the laws of the United States are carried out and properly executed. That means everyone who answers to the President of the United States, including the Department of Homeland Security, including Customs and Border Enforcement, all of DHS should be following the law and pushing others to follow the law and seeing that the law is followed. But yet we see apparently case after case, shockingly, that Homeland Security is getting involved in the human trafficking business, carrying children around the country, seeking them out. How about we get the parent and get the parent together with the child in a country where they're lawfully allowed to be? How about being a good neighbor to Mexico? And instead of providing weapons to drug cartels that have killed hundreds of Mexicans, hundreds of our neighbors in Mexico, how about standing up against the drug cartels, not supplying them weapons, not seeing that drug deals are done, which may help one cartel over another, but actually being a good neighbor so that Mexico becomes the country where people want to stay and work. I've talked to so many Mexicans who really want to live in Mexico, but they have trouble finding jobs. There's so much corruption. In a country where a police chief or a law enforcement officer, someone trying to do the right thing or to stand up against the drug cartel, can end up with their head on a pike. That's our neighbor. Why are we not helping our neighbor stop the killing in massive numbers of our neighbor Mexicans? Instead, we have the Department of Homeland Security as found by the federal courts to continually be helping people violate our own laws. I want families together, but the law needs to be followed. That's why you had judges like I was who had their heart broken when they have to enforce laws that they don't always believe in, but because it's the law duly passed and signed into law by an executive branch. Because we took an oath to enforce the law and follow the law. And then it was shocking to read this story in the Blaze from December 27th. Headline: ATF agent sends shockwaves across the internet with explosive allegations about Fast and Furious and Brian Terry's death. On down in the article, it says that after the Terry slaying, talking about Brian Terry, the federal agent who was killed, said after the Terry slaying and an attempted cover-up within the Justice Department, Dodson, talking about this ATF agent, provided evidence and testimony to Congress. His revelations, later verified by an Office of the Inspector General's report, ignited a national scandal over Fast and Furious that resulted in a congressional contempt citation against Attorney General Eric Holder and the replacement of top ATF and Justice Department officials. In his book, Dodson uses cautious language to characterize his account of circumstances surrounding Terry's death, saying the information is based on first-hand knowledge, personal opinion, and press reports, but he asserts that the DEA had information about and may have orchestrated a large drug shipment through Peck Canyon that December night, talking about the night Brian Terry was killed. He alleges that DEA agents shared that intelligence with FBI counterparts who advised criminal informants from another cartel that the load would be, quote, theirs for the taking, unquote. Dodson laid out a strategy in which federal law enforcement agencies like the FBI allow criminal activity in order to increase the cloud of FBI informants embedded within cartel organizations. Quote, if they can get these guys, the informants, in a position so they're closer to the Tier 1 or the Tier 2 guy in the cartel, they'll do it. The article further down says, quote, essentially, the United States government is involved in cartel building, unquote, Dodson said. The claims sound eerily familiar to allegations brought forward by high-ranking Sinaloa cartel operative Jesus Vicente Zambada Niebla, who is currently facing trial in Chicago on federal drug charges. Further down it says they were given carte blanche to continue to smuggle tons of illicit drugs into Chicago and the rest of the United States, and were also protected by the United States government from arrest and prosecution in return for providing information against rival cartels which helped Mexican and United States authorities capture or kill thousands of rival cartel members, the defense motion in that case reads. It is incredible what is going on, and it is only appropriate that if Congress is to continue funding these agencies and these departments, we should have and do have the right to know what they're doing with our money. And that should also mean getting to the bottom of Fast and Furious. There should be a select committee to get to the bottom of what happened in Fast and Furious. Eventually, there should be mainstream media components that actually do their job for a change that is so important to keeping a free nation by actually going after the administration they have put in place and demanding answers to the questions of what happened with Fast and Furious. We owe our friends to the south, our Mexican neighbors, answers to what happened. It is outrageous for a government to treat a neighbor like this. There's no reason that the country of Mexico should not be one of the top 10 economies in the world. Mexico should be one of the top 10 economies in the world. They have the resources, the natural resources. They have got people willing to work, doing phenomenal work. as we've seen even in this country. They have a beautiful country. But they need to be rid of the drug cartels. They need to be a nation of laws, which eerily brings us back to the demand that some who come into this country illegally make now. We want you to quit being a nation of laws, ignore the law, and say that we're legally here, though we came illegally, which ironically, if we do that, we're no longer a nation of laws, which would make us like the nation of Mexico, where graft and corruption are so many places the rule of the day, where cronyism is the rule so many places, where they don't have the freedom that we have here from fear of drug cartels. I've mentioned a Washington Times story. Unfortunately, there was one in the Washington Times today entitled, "Is Islam a Religion of Peace or a Religion of War?" written by Rahat Hussein. And in this, Mr. Hussein shows that he's either one of the laziest reporters in the world or he's one of the biggest liars. And I quote from the article, "Of course, those who seek to vilify more than 1.6 billion Muslims in the world do so with a serious disregard for logic or morality. In 2010, Congresswoman Debbie Riddle and Congressman Louis Gohmert put a theory into the public discourse that there was such a thing as a, quote, terror baby, unquote," which I've never used that term to describe anybody. So, from Mr. Hussein, Mr. Speaker, that is an outrageous, abominable lie. Now, it's quite possible he could have gotten that from so many of the media sources that do what they do so well. And I go back to a sign that used to be above a blacksmith shop. It was a recreation of an old blacksmith shop just south of Fort Benning in a quaint old village. And the sign above the blacksmith's door said, "All types of bending and twisting done here." So what happens, some in the mainstream, so-called, take a point that I make, twist it into something I didn't say, create this straw dog that they can beat up over and over and over, and run that use up so much in the Internet that if you click on my name, you see this term, though I've never used it, and the point I made was a valid point. This article said, despite the moral depravity of referring to infants as terrorists, which I never did, Mr. Hussein is a liar, Congressman Gohmert defended the notion and then got into a shouting match with CNN's Anderson Cooper, insisting on the validity of his idea. Mr. Hussein's writing does not deserve to be considered as serious literature if he is either that lazy or that significant of a liar. All he'd had to do was research. Hopefully he did that research, which would mean he clearly is one of the largest liars around. Now, if either Anderson Cooper or Mr. Hussein or others would do a little homework, doesn't take that much, they would find that something called birthright tourism is big around the world. It's significant. As I pointed out to Anderson Cooper, there had been an article shortly before that about the Chinese, a tourist agency that for a certain amount of money, they would get you a tourist visa into the United States when you were pregnant, and they would help you get your baby born and then get you an American passport before you left. Then I saw right after that an article where there was a Muslim-owned hotel in New York that was hurt because they said they were the first ones to come up with this idea of having, in their case, basically Muslim pregnant women come to the United States, have a baby, and then they'd help you get the American passport when you return to your country. The point that I was making, and it's still a legitimate point, there are people who hate the United States who come into this country, have a child, and children are a gift from God. They are. That's why abortion is so wrong. But that great gift and the responsibility that comes with having a child to train them up in a wholesome environment as best you can, not to hate people, and yet we have children that leave this country with American passport and go back to the country where their parents are citizens and then are raised to hate America. Some may remember that in 2011, a man named Anwar al-Awlaki, an American citizen, was killed by a drone in Yemen. Anwar al-Awlaki had been here on Capitol Hill numerous times. He had friends at the White House. He had friends in this administration. He had been on Capitol Hill leading Muslim staff members in Muslim prayer. Why? How could he do it? Because he was an American citizen. How was Anwar al-Awlaki an American citizen? His parents came here on a visa to go to college. He was born, returned to Yemen, was raised to hate America, raised to hate our Western democracy, and as an adult became a terrorist who incited others to terrorism against the United States. Perhaps some have heard of a guy named Al-Moody. Actually, the guy that I had the paperwork, held it up for the director of the FBI, Director Mueller, and he was not aware at all that the Boston mosques that the Boston bombers attended were started, and we had the paper, the Boston Society, that did that. Al-Moody was the founder. And Al-Moody was a friend and an advisor in the Clinton administration. But during the Bush administration, he was arrested at Dulles Airport and later pled guilty, was sentenced to 23 years in prison for supporting terrorism. It might be worth noting for someone in Homeland Security or the State Department that Al-Moody, convicted and now imprisoned for supporting terrorism, while his wife was here on a visa, had a child who is an American citizen. A man named Morsi, president of Egypt, until he began to disregard the Constitution of Egypt to the extent that people rose up in Egypt in numbers greater than anywhere in history of the world. and demanded his ouster. As the Coptic Christian Pope has said, this wasn't a coup. This was the Egyptian people rising up as never before, reported in over twice the numbers that President Morsi claims voted for him to make him president. But it appeared he was doing as Chavez had done. It appeared he was doing, as one Egyptian told me, as the president who was elected in the Gaza Strip had done. Once he had an election, he pulled all the power to himself, and they didn't need elections after that. There would never be anybody defeat him like Chavez did in Venezuela. They could see it happening, and as one Egyptian told me, in Egypt, within the last few weeks, if the Egyptian people had waited another year to try to remove Morsi from office, they would have been unable. He would have pulled that much power unto himself. So I think accolades should go out to the Egyptian people for rising up and demanding democracy, demanding the fruition of a true Arab Spring. And for people who are ignorant or promoting lies like Mr. Hussein, if you would do some checking, you would find that I have moderate Muslim friends around the world. Because anyone, Muslim, secularist, any persuasion, race, creed, color, or religion, national religion, if they believe in freedom, they're brothers in liberty. And something I think it would do well for this administration to learn at some point before it's too late, we should be able to work with the enemy of our enemy. Moderate Muslims in Afghanistan do not want radical Islamists leading and in charge of Afghanistan again. There is a simple answer to the problem of us leaving Afghanistan, which will soon become Taliban-run again. And this administration's bungling, even though the bungling began in the last administration, in fairness, it did. But the final bungling will be by this administration if we don't take action to prevent those who fought for this country for believing they died, their loved ones died in vain. I don't believe they did. They fought for liberty. But I've heard from too many family members who've lost loved ones in Afghanistan who have said, don't let our loved one have died in vain. The Taliban were defeated in a matter of months in Afghanistan. And we did it with less than 500 embedded special ops intelligence. We gave air support, provided some weapons, and they defeated the Taliban. Former Vice President under Karzai in the first administration, former Vice President Massoud, a friend of mine, a Muslim, rushed out of his home to embrace me when I got there not too long ago because he knew I was his friend. I don't want him to live under radical Islam. He doesn't want to live under radical Islam. And this brilliant friend said, look, if you could just help us get an amendment to our Constitution. So what are you talking about? He said, you know, under our Constitution that you apparently rubber-stamped, in essence, a strong centralized government was created in a country that has been and is and will be for the foreseeable future very tribal, very regional. And we tried to make it into a strong centralized government when what the people wanted was a federalist system where the states, where the regions had some self-autonomy like we're supposed to have in this country. He said if we could elect our own governors, and it's a shock to so many, the Constitution that we thought was okay under the Bush administration allows the President of Afghanistan to appoint the regional governors, to appoint the mayors, to appoint the chiefs of police. He appoints the top-level teachers. He appoints a slate of the legislators for a part of the legislature. He has powerful abilities to manipulate the purse strings. What we created in Afghanistan, or helped them create, was a formula for disaster and corruption. How could you give one man that much authority to appoint and not expect corruption? When you get to appoint all the governors, and as my friend, former Vice President Massoud told me there at his home, if we could have an amendment that allowed us to elect our governors, allowed us to elect our mayors, allowed us to select at least our own chiefs of police, then our regions would be strong enough to prevent the Taliban from taking back over the whole country. And we could rally together as we did before to overrun them and run them out of the country. And I said, what makes you think that the United States could help push an amendment through your own Constitution? That needs to happen here in Afghanistan, I said. But he pointed out, do you have any idea how much our federal government budget is? I had to admit I didn't know. He said around $12.5 billion of your dollars. He said, do you know how much Afghanistan provides of our $12.5 billion or so budget? Didn't know. About $1.5 billion. Other moderate Muslims there were all in agreement. You need to help us with this. And he said most of the rest of that $11 billion comes from the United States. You have the leverage to help us get an amendment to our Constitution. Instead of trying to work out some messed up status of forces agreement, as we've seen this administration try to do in Iraq to no avail, instead of doing that, why don't we start pushing Karzai and say, you either help get an amendment in there so you don't get to appoint everybody who's anybody in this country. We'll let each state or each region elect their own governor. Let's get that amendment in there. Otherwise, we're going to cut every dime of support off. That might have some sway. We have the ability, we have the leverage, and we have, for a little bit longer, before we totally lose it, some moral authority to seek that on behalf of our moderate Muslim friends in Afghanistan who don't want to be killed because they fought with us and for us in defeating the Taliban before we became occupiers, before we gave them a centralized government that the Taliban can easily take over when we leave. We owe them that. And we owe ourselves that, because if we can empower the enemy of the Taliban to continue to keep the Taliban at bay in Afghanistan, we've done a great thing. We've helped our country, and we've helped our moderate Muslim friends in Afghanistan who do not want to live under Taliban tyranny again, and they don't want to die and be killed because they helped us and then we abandoned them. We owe them that. I hope Mr. Hussein, that's writing this garbage for the Washington Times, will do a little research. He'll also find out, if he did so, that President Morsi, the Muslim brother who was elected president, reportedly, some say it was a fraudulent election or election result, but anyway, he was made president and then began to abuse and abuse the constitutional powers, tighten the reins around him. I was told by friends who love Israel that this is really exciting because Morsi is really our friend. He's really cleaning up the Sinai. And after Morsi was removed, we found out the Sinai has been incredibly militarized by Morsi. What would you expect of a man who had said that Jews are descended from apes and pigs? That's not a friend of Israel. And yet you have the Egyptian government now taking action to demilitarize, to fight the radical Islamists in the Sinai that pose a threat to the Suez Canal, that pose a threat to our friend Israel, and they're actually trying to take action. And what did this administration do? Well, they had promised 10 Apache helicopters to the Morsi presidency, to that regime. But when the people of Egypt rose up in true democratic form and demanded and got the ouster of a man trying to become a tyrant, this administration wanted Morsi put back in place, even sent a couple of Republican senators over there to ask for Morsi to be released from prison, and they didn't even know, as General al-Sisi finally admitted to me in the presence of our ambassador, that yes, they had evidence that Morsi was trying to have a contract to have General al-Sisi killed, murdered, trying to hire a contract killer. And that was just one of the many problems that Morsi created. Now, President Morsi said he'd backed off his membership, his participation in the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah, right. There's video of him having orders dictated and delivered to him on what he should do by supreme leader there. And what happened when Morsi was removed? The Muslim Brotherhood went berserk. They began burning churches by the dozens, killing Christians, persecuting Jews and Christians like never before, persecuting moderate Muslims. And I am so proud of the people of Egypt. They want a democracy. A man named Amir Musa was appointed as chairman of the Constitutional Convention. Incredibly diverse groups there, incredibly diverse interests, yet they all agreed on this to start out under Musa's leadership, that unless 75% of all of those delegates to the Constitutional Convention agreed on a provision, it wouldn't be there. And they, as Chairman Musa pointed out to me personally, he said, you know, we learned from your Constitution. Basically, he said, you know, our prior Constitution under Morsi had no provision for impeachment. There was no way to lawfully remove him under that Constitution, which was the way Morsi wanted it. And in their new Constitution, they have provisions for impeachment. And this Constitutional Convention was led by moderate Muslim friends like Amir Musa. And it was endorsed by the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, a very well-respected Muslim leader, and has been endorsed by so many Muslim leaders. They don't want radical Islam in charge. Moderate Muslims can be and are our friends. And instead, this administration canceled the order for the 10 Apaches, or at least suspended it. And what is Egypt doing with the Apaches they already have? They're fighting radical Islamists in the Sinai, and they're making sure ships get through the Suez Canal. Well, that should be a worthy endeavor, worthy of this administration not condemning a true democracy in the making in Egypt, but trying to help them keep the Suez Canal open, trying to help them demilitarize the radical Islamists controlling the Sinai as a threat to the Suez, to Egypt, and to our friends Israel and Jordan and others. In that Constitution, the Convention approved and which will be voted on in Egypt January 14th and 15th, Article 64 is a provision for freedom, stating that freedom of belief is absolute. You have an absolute freedom to believe in whatever religious beliefs you care to believe in without the government's harm. What we're seeing here is really, if it works out, the people approve it, is the beginning of what we saw in Turkey with Ataturk so many decades ago when he overran radical Islam, and Turkey bloomed and became a great nation under his leadership and under those who followed what he set forth. Article 93 of the new Egyptian Constitution commits that Egypt is obligated to observe all human rights that Egypt has ever endorsed and in all treaties to which it has agreed. Article 235 was shocking to me. In their new constitution, the moderate Muslims of Egypt who wanted democracy, they felt so badly about the radical Islamists that make up the Muslim Brotherhood burning so many churches, persecuting, killing so many Christians, that Article 235 requires that the first Parliament pass a law to deal with the churches that were burned, to ensure that Egypt rebuilds those churches for them. What a statement to the world about the freedom they want to see take place. That's why it was so moving to people that told me about being there firsthand during the revolutionary masses as they came forward by the millions, holding hands figuratively and literally, Christians, moderate Muslims, secularists, Jews, saying we don't want radical Islam. It's high time this administration began helping the enemy of our enemy instead of trying to help our enemy. As General al-Sisi asked me, are you in the United States still with us in the war against terror? He and others commented to the fact that United States leaders do not seem to believe we're still having to fight terrorists anymore. They are fighting them in this new government. Now, to be sure, they've got a long, tough road ahead because they are already where this nation is heading with massive welfare state, where so many of the citizens are getting giveaways from the government, where they've tried this idea of redistribution of the wealth, and it's led to many more and much richer people and much, much poorer people, just as we have seen in this nation in the last 5 years, and it needs to stop. And another thing that needs to stop was reported in Breitbart, written by Francis Martel. State Department whistleblower has email hacked. The story talks about the whistleblower who helped expose misconduct by Hillary Clinton's security detail had his Gmail account hacked and key evidence against State Department officials deleted, according to an exclusive New York Post report. Diplomatic Security Service criminal investigator Richard Higbee had exposed earlier this year that the State Department allegedly covered up reports alleging improprieties by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's security detail in which they had engaged with prostitutes abroad. Those reports would have also exposed the Belgian ambassador's alleged attempts to solicit, and it goes on. But the article says the Gmail hack deleted 4 years' worth of messages, according to Schulman, including significant damning evidence against high-ranking officials in the State Department. It also included messages with evidence sent to members of Congress and their offices investigating the story. Higbee has called for the FBI to investigate the hacking and continues to have unanswered questions about other strange occurrences, which he began to expose the covered-up investigation. The article goes on, and that goes hand in hand with another story that was reported in the past 6 months or so of a whistleblower having her and her husband's home burglarized, and they ended up taking all of that reporter's files that she had used to expose wrongdoing, misconduct within the very department that raided her home and took her records and won't give them back. And at the same time, this administration continues to send people to the nation of Israel, the Jewish state, the home where people could come by the millions after 6 million were killed in the Holocaust of World War II. And we have the nerve to send people over to the leaders of Israel and tell them they have got to give away more land, when every time they have given away land, whether it was northern Israel, that's now southern Lebanon, or whether it's the Gaza Strip, anything they've given away ends up being used as a staging area from which to attack it, and those to whom the land is given use our money we provide for books to teach their children to hate Jews, to hate Israelis, and to hate the United States. As I've said for years, you don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for free. We could make our word good to our veterans if we just quit paying the people that hate us. Let them hate us for free. Maybe they'd learn to like us and come ask to work with us and find out we're actually pretty decent people if we quit paying them to hate us. The Palestinians was reported January 1st in this Jerusalem Post article, said Palestinians reiterate plans to reject any framework accord presented by the U.S., and yet we send over our Secretary of State, well-meaning, and others to demand Israel give up more land to people that say they will reject it but give us more land from which we can attack you. And I think about the verses in Jeremiah where the prophecy is there that there will be grapes grown in the mountains of Samaria that some are saying doesn't belong to Israel. Well, it used to. 1,600 years before a man named Muhammad was born, King David was ruling in that region. But over the years, over the decades and centuries, people have said, look, that area, those mountains of Samaria will not grow grapes. That's ridiculous. And yet in the past couple of years, I've tasted those grapes. The vineyards are beautiful. They are Israeli, Jewish vineyards in the mountains of Samaria, just as Jeremiah prophesied would happen, and God would make it happen. and we send a Secretary of State over saying, you got to give away what you believe God providentially provided to you. We, the United States, no more than any God you believe in, give it away. It's been prophesied. I'd hate to go against prophecy. And yet, this article from the Telegraph, Iran nuclear deal, Saudi Arabia warns it will strike out on its own. As Steve King, Michelle Bachmann, and I, Robert Pittenger, traveled to some of the countries in the Middle East, as others of us traveled around the Middle East back in September, it is incredible. But this administration, with what it's doing in Iran, the rest of the Middle East believes is going to allow Iran to have nukes, and Saudi Arabia and our other allies and our enemies all want nukes, and nuclear proliferation will become just a rule of thumb, which is why I think this article appeared January 2nd, the Washington Times, showing a comment that makes sense now, but anti-communist icon decries Obama, U.S. no longer leads the world. This was from Lech Walesa, and he had great hopes for the United States. He had obviously had great hopes for this administration. He said whatever hope in the world existed that Obama would reclaim more leadership for America when elected in 2008 is gone, and instead the president has failed to bring that dream to fruition. He told CNN, quote, we have to do everything we can to reclaim America's role, and it seems that Obama would manage that, but he didn't accomplish that, unquote, he said. Quote, America did not regain its leadership status. We're just lucky there were no bigger conflicts in the world, because if it had had bigger conflicts, then the world would be helpless, unquote. The trouble is, 2014 will be a year in which there are bigger conflicts, bigger issues. It's time we did the moral thing by our military veterans. It's time we did the moral thing by stopping the spending of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren's money. And it's time we did the moral thing by our friends and quit helping our friends' enemies hurt our friends. We need to regain, as Lech Walesa said, the moral authority we once had. That can be done, and we need to seize the day and do it. With that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3, 2013, the gentleman from California, Mr. Garamendi, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.